France was one of the wealthiest countries in Europe, but the wealth was not spread equally among the people, and this caused unhappiness. The success of the American Revolution caused the working men and women in France to desire change, and this led to the French Revolution. France's social system caused great inequality among the French people. This pyramid represents the divisions in France's social system. The French social structure was organized into 3 estates, or 3 orders of society. At the very top of the French social order was the first estate, and this was made of the Roman Catholic clergy, or priests. These people made up about 1% of the population. The highest members of the church, bishops and abbots, owned between 5 and 10% of all the land in France. They enjoyed many privileges. They got revenues from land and the tithe, which is a 10% tax all church members had to pay on everything they made in a given year. Most of this money collected by the church was used for schools and to help the poor, but a lot of that money was also used to pay for the grand and luxurious lifestyles of the higher clergy. France's second estate was made up of the nobility, about 2% of the population, but they owned about 25% of all the land. Like the first estate, the nobility enjoyed privileges and lived in great style. Some had high posts in the government or the military, and some lived at the palace at Versailles. Others lived outside of Versailles, but had lavish or expensive homes. The main income of the nobility came from feudal dues collected from peasants who lived and worked on their land. The third estate was the lowest level of the social structure in France. However, it was the largest group. It included peasants, artisans, and the bourgeoisie, which is a fancy word for the middle class. The third estate had few political rights or privileges. The bourgeoisie included doctors, lawyers, merchants, and businessmen. They were pretty educated and pretty well off financially, and most of the bourgeoisie lived in towns and cities. Peasants, the other part of the third estate, lived in rural areas, and they actually owned about 40% of the land in France. Now, despite all of this land that they owned, they were still poor because they had to pay the tithe, the tax, to the clergy, and they had to pay feudal dues to the nobles. They even had to pay a land tax to the king. The third estate had no voice in government. In France during the 1700s, there were many changes that occurred that led to a growing unrest and eventually led to the French Revolution. The third estate wanted to change the unfair social structure. They were hurt by the rising prices, and members of the bourgeoisie wanted to have more political power. Believe it or not, the second estate, nobles, also wanted to change the social structure in France. They wanted to reduce the king's power, and they wanted to increase their own political influence. The ruler of France during this time of growing unrest was a young man, a 19-year-old, named King Louis. This was King Louis XVI, and in 1774 he took the throne with his wife, Marie Antoinette. While Louis was in charge, France had serious economic troubles. France was in debt from previous kings and also from supporting the American Revolution financially. King Louis recognized this debt, and he tried to cut costs in his government. He also tried to tax the nobility and the clergy to raise more money, but the nobility and the clergy refused to pay these taxes. Because of these economic troubles, banks stopped lending money to the French government, and crop failures caused famines in 1788 and 1789, contributing to the growing unrest. In response, Louis called a meeting of the Estates General, which is the legislature, the law-making body in France. He called the Estates General to meet in May of 1789 to help raise taxes. The king called a meeting of the Estates General in hopes that the first and second estates, the nobles and the clergy, would agree to new taxes to help France out of its economic troubles. However, the nobles didn't want to pay a new tax. They wanted to use the Estates General to weaken royal power and to gain government control for themselves. Because each estate got one vote in the Estates General, the first and second estates could easily team up to dominate the third estate, which left the Third Estate angry and feeling betrayed. The Third Estate refused to be pushed aside and pushed around by the First and Second Estate in the Estates General. The Third Estate claimed that they had more of a right to represent France than either clergies or the nobles. The representatives of the Third Estate were locked out of the Estates General one day. So they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court, they named themselves the National Assembly, and they took an oath promising to not disband until they wrote a new constitution for France. This was called the Tennis Court Oath. And the king did not want just the members of the Third Estate organizing a new French government. So the king actually ordered the First and Second Estate to leave the Estates General and to join the National Assembly, where they could all work together to solve France's problems. Led by the Third Estate, the National Assembly began calling for social equality in France. And this was a huge controversy in France at the time, and people in cities and in the countryside were debating. The king created a panic by ordering troops to Paris and troops to protect his palace at Versailles. The citizens thought with the king moving these troops that he was planning to dissolve the National Assembly, and in their rage they formed a mob or a riot, and they attacked a Paris prison called the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was attacked because it was a symbol of the injustices of the monarchy. When the king didn't like someone and had them thrown in jail, oftentimes they were thrown into the Bastille. On July 14, 1789, a mob of angry citizens stormed the Bastille. They attacked the prison. Armed with axes, they freed prisoners, but 98 of the rioters were killed by guards. This led to the formation of the revolutionary government in Paris. The storming of the Bastille caused a great wave of violence to move throughout France, from the cities into the countryside. This violence was called the Great Fear. Peasants armed themselves and they attacked their landlords and nobles. And then landlords and nobles in nearby areas, hearing about the attacks, began to arm themselves. And a great cycle of violence was created that completely destabilized France.